Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, former US Ambassador Chas Freeman. Ambassador Freeman is an American retired diplomat, an author, and a commentator on geopolitics. Ambassador Freeman, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Glad to be with you, Joseph.
I want to start with Palestine, given the IPC, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, a UN-backed body, has recently come up with this report saying that the Gaza city alone has more than 500,000 people suffering from catastrophic famine, and it can very well spread into Dar el-Balah and Khan Yunis next month, where the Israelis are now debating about expanding their military operation from the Mora corridor in the south and the Netzarim in the north. And this is the report says that this is not just due to the failure of aid distribution and the collapse of the market, the commercial mechanisms through which food reaches, but also a catastrophic collapse of destruction of 98% of the cropland and more than 90% of the livestock. What is your assessment of what is going on in Gaza at this moment?
Well, it's an unbelievably cruel, horrifying situation there. This is entirely deliberate. It is caused by several factors. The principal one is the blockage of food and other humanitarian assistance to the inhabitants of Gaza. That is reinforced by voluntary action by individual Israeli settlers who when trucks approach the Gaza crossing, often assault the trucks and destroy the food and other supplies that are on them. So this is not just an Israeli government instance of genocide. It is actually genocide conducted by ordinary Israelis against the Palestinians there. There's a second factor, and that is, of course, that Israel has destroyed the effective governance of Gaza, which Hamas kept remarkably orderly for a long time. But by trying to destroy Hamas, it basically exterminate Palestinians so as to rid Israel of the boogeyman of Hamas. They have also put Gaza into a state of anarchy. They also finally, the Israelis also appear to have been working actively with Palestinian gangs who exploit the suffering of their fellow Palestinians by seizing food and other supplies if they do get it into Gaza, and basically distorting the market, behaving like the criminal gangs that they are. So this is an appalling situation. And you referred to the 500,000 or so people on the brink of death from starvation in Gaza City. Among them are 130,000 children. And we're told that if there is, maybe even if there is aid now put in, many of those children will die. And if there's no aid, they'll all die of starvation. So this is a horror, the likes of which we have not seen since medieval times.
I want to discuss a little bit about what the mainstream media, the Western media, has been describing as negotiations led by, let's say, the American Palestinian, Bissara Bahaba, along with Qatar and Egypt, talking to Hamas and then passing on information to Steve Witkoff, who is in turn talking to Netanyahu. I mean, that's the impression we are getting. And it is often presented as a negotiation. While the Marib newspaper, the Israeli newspaper today, says that Netanyahu has to continue, is planning to continue this, and they are citing Israeli military sources because the moment he stops this war, his government collapses, and we are seeing these huge divisions within Israeli society. You are a former ambassador. My question question to you is it fair to still call these talks or these what appears to me as something for public consumption? Are these really negotiations, or are these theaters that the Western press and the whole cabal is creating a charade for us to consume, thinking that there are really attempts made to stop this genocide? What is your assessment of what's going on at that front?
Well, I don't think these are true negotiations. They are an effort to impose a surrender and a suicidal surrender on the Palestinian leadership. They are an effort to finish Palestinian nationalism once and for all. Um, and therefore, there's no real give and take. The intention is not to reach an agreement, but to achieve a capitulation. So that's the first point. The second is that there's no evidence at all that the Israeli side, Prime Minister Netanyahu in particular, have any intention of reaching an agreement with Hamas. Their continually stated objective is to destroy Hamas, to cause Hamas to either be killed or commit suicide. This is not a negotiation aiming at any meeting of the minds. And the third point is, of course, you're absolutely correct. The Western media, the American media in particular, uh, continue to engage in a strange mixture of cover up and wishful thinking about these interactions. I say a cover up because you still hear people denying, along with Prime Minister Netanyahu, that the starvation in Gaza is real, or that it has a cause in Israeli policy. At the same time, of course, other members of the Israeli establishment are openly declaring that all Palestinians should be killed. We've seen this from young Israelis as well as from people in the cabinet. So, no, I don't think this is a genuine negotiation. I think it's another example of flim flam, if you will, that is performative performative actions. It seems that in the current era, and the Trump administration exemplifies this in many ways, that if leaders find it impossible to accomplish something, they then try to establish the illusion that they've accomplished something. And so we're seeing a manipulation of images and stories, narratives that bears very little resemblance to what is actually happening.
Part of the reason for these manipulations is also a huge divide in the West, both in the United States and Europe, between, let's say, the popular opinion on matters of Israel and Palestine now, and what has been done from the ruling elites. There are some polls in the US that says that maybe even two-thirds of the population has now turned against Israeli atrocities in Palestine. We are seeing similar trends in Europe, and part of this is a reflection why countries like France and the UK are saying that they are going to recognize Palestinian statehood, or they're condemning the E1 settlement in the occupied West Bank. My question to you, Ambassador, is how long do you think will the ruling elites in the West be able to live with these contradictions? Are we somewhere near the brink where they will soon have to reconcile this huge divide, or do you think this can be pushed on as long as the billionaire class holds control over the U.S. politics?
Well, basically, the irony here, of course, is that a large part of the reason for the rise of populism as a threat to democracy, constitutional democracy, in the West generally, in the United States in particular, but not in Europe is not excluded from this, is precisely that the elites, the governing elites, appear to be indifferent to mass opinion. So you have very clear majorities in favor of quite a number of things, and they're simply ignored as the politicians play games with each other to their financial and other advantage. So This is a sickness of Western democracy at the present time, which is very threatening to it. Now, you ask at what point the elites will will bow to popular opinion. I doubt they will do so unless and until they are overthrown. And I think the moment is coming when that may well happen, because I'm always mindful of the brilliant little book by Alfred O. Hirschman called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, in which he applies economic reasoning to politics. And he basically concludes, looking first at corporate models and then at governance models, that the key to stability in any system, any economic or political system, is a high level of apathy. That is, that people are just willing to go along with whatever it is that's happening. But if the performance of the company or the government concerned it falls short, you have a phenomenon first where people exit, they just drop out. They refuse to accept the legitimacy of the product, whether it's an automobile or a policy. Then the next group of people give voice. They write letters to the company saying, "You're producing lousy automobiles. I'm not going to buy any more of your cars, even though my father, my grandfather, my great grandfather all bought your company's products. I'm out unless you get your act together." They give voice. Well, we see that in the political sphere with mass protests. Um, at some point, the level of apathy falls below the point at which stability can be maintained, and that is, I think, what is happening actually. So this is a very unstable situation in the United States and elsewhere, and you can see the consequences of this. Actually, President Trump, who rode this populist wave into power, is now struggling to sustain his own base as he takes actions or fails to take actions that are strongly supported or opposed by members of his own cult, if you will. So I think it's an excellent question, but I think we are entering a pre-revolutionary situation in the constitutional democracies of the West.
And we are not certain what would replace or what would succeed that pre-revolutionary situation. As Rosa Luxemburg once said, that barbarism or socialism, I mean, for her, socialism is kind of progressive reconstitution of society. So we are you hopeful when you say we are at a pre-revolutionary situation? Are you hopeful that something better will replace it, or are you uncertain what will come next?
I'm very uncertain what will replace it. I think I learned very early on. I was at the Harvard Law School, and I was 20 years old. I was underage, really too young to be in that brutal environment. But one of my classmates was a very old man in his late 20s or early 30s, who had been in the Bay of Pigs invasion, a Cuban, and he'd been ransomed out of Cuba in exchange for a tractor. And he was a lawyer in Havana prior to his disaffection and participation in that regime change operation. And he had to be retrained in the common law because, as you know, civil law and common law, although they come to the same conclusions very often, have very different procedural mechanisms for doing that. So he was being retrained, and Ngo Dinh the president of South Vietnam, was assassinated by the United States. And I was very concerned about what I saw happening in Indochina. And I had coffee with my friend, and I said I was very pleased because I hoped it now that South Vietnam might get decent, appealing leadership that could actually sustain it as a state. And I remember what he said to me. He said, "Why do you suppose that the successor will be better than the person who's been felled?" Um, and I've always remembered that because you have no idea. Having said that, there is a possibility, one can see it in New York politics with Mamdani, um, that the electoral mechanisms, which are designed to allow changes of government and facilitate them, might work. And we might have something radically different coming into being in terms of the ideological content of our government. But having said that, I will say also that there's a lot of nonsense about democracy. We had a republic. The republic was a representative system in which the representatives of the people were meant to exercise their own judgment, not to be rubber stamps for mass opinion. We did not have a government that ran by referendum. A lot of that has changed. But the essence of the government was constitutional restraint on government power and the rule of law, procedural justice, if you will. That is to say, due process, the idea that the result of a deliberation or a policy formulation is the legitimacy of that result is to be determined by whether the process was fair or not. If it was fair, then you have to accept the result. The purpose of courts, the purpose of a court system is not to administer justice, although you hope it does. It is to quell controversies, to go through a process which legitimizes an end to whatever quarrel is being dealt with. So it is possible that there's enough left of our constitutional electoral system to elevate to power people who will be less estranged from the public. But I'm also well aware of the of George Orwell and other people who uh, point out that once in power, pigs seem to lose their idealism and become exactly what they replaced in the beginning. So we have a problem. I would dare say that this problem is not limited to the West. It is very evident in Israel. It is very evident in India. And it has long been evident in Pakistan. And it seems to be an almost universal phenomenon, which I find very depressing to think about.
You mentioned about the killing in South Vietnam, and Kennedy himself was very unhappy with that. He was unaware of that killing, and prior to that, he said, "My God, how do I get off Vietnam?" Because all everyone surrounding him were so divided on what their policy would be regarding the government in South Vietnam. And this reflects the kind of pressure that the president in the United States has. And this brings me to Trump himself, because yesterday I interviewed Ambassador Alistair Crook, and I asked him about his interpretation of the talks and summits with Russia on one hand and the West and Ukraine on the other hand. And I'm pivoting to that conversation with you now. And he said that a significant in his understanding, a significant reason why Trump is opening up suddenly to Putin, jettisoning the Kellogg plan, which was pretty much the long-standing Western plan, is that Trump is under tremendous pressure from his MAGA base. On one hand, the inability to change situation in Gaza, but more primarily what is happening with the Epstein file. So I'm very curious about what's your interpretation about these conversations, negotiations, summits with Russia on one hand and the West and Ukraine on the other hand?
Well, I think I agree with Alistair in part. That is to say, the meeting in Anchorage was partly performative. It was an effort to change the subject. It was an effort to divert attention from Trump's basic failure to accomplish what he promised his supporters he would do. In fact, in many ways, he's done the opposite of what he promised on not just on foreign policy, but on other matters. And of course, he must be aware that notwithstanding his adherence to the Peter Navarro School of Economics, which, as far as I can tell, has about one member other than President Trump, that is Peter Navarro himself, um, I think he must be aware that we're about to face a surge of inflation from the tariffs, which are finally going into effect. The effects have been masked. And I note also that the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Powell, at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, in a meeting with central bankers yesterday, Friday, described his position on changing interest rates as open-minded, but he noted that he excused his inability to say whether he would lower or raise interest rates by saying that the United States now had a contracting labor market. That is to say, the number of people employed was going down. Many of them dropped out so they've exited the employment market. That keeps the nominal unemployment rate low. But this is characteristic of a recession. It is a slowing of growth or the reversal of growth in the economy. And he said that, of course, offsets inflation. So on the one hand, we have inflation. On the other hand, we have declining economic growth. That is the textbook definition of stagflation,
Stagflation, right?
Which is not a good thing. It is not a good thing. So I think President Trump faces multiple difficulties. And his characteristic response to these things, as I said, is to do something, put the troops on the streets in Washington, D.C., go to Anchorage and welcome President Putin and so forth. But there's more to this than that. He has an ambition to get the Nobel Peace Prize. You and I and others may consider that to be a forlorn hope, but he apparently does take that prospect seriously. He's even
I
called the
mean,
Norwegian government.
Obama bombed Afghanistan and destroyed Libya, and he got a Nobel Prize. So you never know.
Well, exactly. The Nobel Peace Prize was greatly devalued by its award to President Obama, who was a very decent fellow, I think, but he got it basically for being of mixed race and not for anything else. He seemed to people in Norway to represent a real sea change in American politics. Perhaps he did. Anyway, they couldn't think of any other way to get him to Oslo, so they gave him a prize so he would come. Anyway, I want to say that I think that Trump's motives are multiple. He does really want to produce a peace in Ukraine. I don't think he cares much about Ukrainians. And I don't think he had, until he went to Anchorage, I don't think he had any grasp at all of the issues at stake in Europe. He went and he did something very important. He listened directly to Vladimir Putin. Not only that, he greeted Vladimir Putin as an equal. I mean, you could not have a more stark contrast than that between his greeting of Putin in Anchorage and his impersonating the headmaster at a school with a bunch of recalcitrant students with the 7 European dwarves who came to the Oval Office to be chastised and bamboozled by the great master, President Trump. So he's been criticized for conferring equality on President Putin. I think that was exactly the right thing to do. It opens the door to peace. It does not create a peace process. And it's clear that there is some confusion coming out of that meeting, as there always is in meetings with Trump. Since he doesn't prepare, he has no clear fixed objective. What happened is always a matter of dispute. So he did persuade Vladimir Putin to agree to meet with President Volodymyr Zelensky, which President Putin had earlier declined to do. However, Of course, President Putin will not go to such a meeting unless there is an agenda that has been set by careful work at the lower levels. Um, Summits are generally for ratification of decisions that have been worked out at lower levels under the guidance of the leaders. They are not for a negotiation from ab initio. And yet, that is exactly what President Trump did in Anchorage. So we come out of that. He also apparently misunderstood the Russian reference to security guarantees. Russia needs security guarantees. In effect, it started this war because it couldn't get security guarantees. It was constantly being menaced by the enlargement of the NATO presence in Ukraine and the possible membership of Ukraine in NATO. And I think actually one of the most interesting things to me, telling things, is the current discussion of security guarantees, which seems to be entirely military and entirely unacceptable to Russia. That is, Europeans claiming they will put troops on the ground in Ukraine, and President Trump hinting he might authorize a no-fly zone approach to Ukraine, patrolling it from the air with American aircraft, none of which has any chance at all of being accepted by the Russians. This is exactly why they went to war. They're not going to give up their objective of eliminating the menace that they perceive from Ukraine. The very interesting thing to me is security guarantees don't have to be directly military. Look at the example of the Austrian State Treaty of 1955. In that treaty, the independent Austria, which had been occupied by the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and France, was given a status as an independent neutral state. The treaty itself doesn't refer to neutrality, but those who guaranteed the independence and neutrality of Austria knew exactly what they were doing. That treaty guaranteed minority rights within Austria, so that Slovenes, Hungarians, Italians, and others who desired cultural and linguistic autonomy, similar to that in Quebec, Canada, got a guarantee of that. It's
And
worked
going
very well.
and going by what happened in Yugoslavia later, one could argue that that was a pretty successful one.
It was. You could say you can cite other examples. Switzerland, 1820. European powers agreed on the independence and neutrality of Switzerland, and that has lasted very successfully. Switzerland now seems to be sliding into a bit of alignment with NATO, but still, that lasted. I think in the 1880s, Belgian neutrality and independence was recognized by the relevant powers as a buffer state. So there are examples of guarantees backed by the possibility of the use of force, but not involving military deployments. There are no foreign troops in Austria. There are no foreign troops in Switzerland. There were no foreign troops in Belgium. And so why is this discussion of security guarantees failing to address the underlying questions, which are how can you prevent the Russians from perceiving a threat from Ukraine and from the West? How can you prevent the West from perceiving a threat from Russia? Both sides have exaggerated fears, obviously. The Russians have shown they're prepared to go to war over those fears. The Europeans have shown not that they will go to war, but that they're prepared to fight to the last Ukrainian in their own interest to weaken and isolate Russia. That hasn't worked. We are almost down to the last Ukrainian. As we speak, the front is crumbling. Ukraine does not have the manpower to continue this war. There was recently an alleged hack of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, which revealed documents which appear to be genuine. I mean, when I first saw them, I thought, this is hard to believe, but they document a combination of killed in action missing in action, defection, um, desertion of 1.7 million Ukrainians in the last three and a half years. This corroborates what most military experts who've examined the issue, free of Western propaganda, Ukrainian propaganda, relayed and amplified by the West, that the Ukrainian losses have greatly outnumbered and those on the Russian side. The Russians have been quite cautious in the way they've advanced, which is why it hasn't been a blitzkrieg. It's been slow. And phrases like unprovoked aggression, full-scale invasion, and so on are propaganda. So it looks as though we are beginning to see some of the true contours of that struggle, and they are very, very ugly. And anyone who does care about Ukraine should want to endorse the 69% of Ukrainians who now favor a negotiated end to the war. The majority, a large majority, don't want to continue this war. We may have a false impression of them because their performance on the battlefield has been heroic. Ukrainians have shown themselves to be brave and innovative and skilled at warfare, but it's not enough. And this needs to come to an end. And I think President Trump, to his credit, does recognize that, and he sees it as an opportunity. His problem is that he's surrounded by incompetent people who do not, who amplify his own incompetence rather than correct it, and who tell him what he wants to hear. And when they do tell him something he doesn't want to hear, he fires them or gives them the cold shoulder. So we see that the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency has just been fired for reporting that the attack on Iran did not obliterate the Iranian nuclear program. No way to run a government, in my
earlier, one of the chiefs of the Labor Bureau was fired when some of these labor market data came out.
Well, and then also you can say, basically, Tulsi Gabbard, when she gave a wrong, a politically incorrect answer to a question, has been given the cold shoulder. And you now see her doing all kinds of outlandish things to re-ingratiate herself with the great man in the White House.
Apart from apart from the incompetent group of people surrounding him, there are also structural contradictions to this peace negotiation. One, as you said, that the whole understanding about renegotiating the security framework in Eurasia is completely either misunderstood or overlooked in the West. Russia has been constantly saying, and now very explicitly from Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and others, that any negotiations in terms of security framework would have to definitely involve Russia, but potentially also China. But the West has been, including the current Ukrainian government, they have been constantly denying that. So that's one set of contradictions, which realist thinkers like Professor Mearsheimer would say that these are irresolvable. There are others, of course, who are more constructive. Let's say I interviewed Professor Nikolai Petrov. He said something along the lines you just presented, that there have been precedents in history where, you know, there can be multiple arrangements. It doesn't have to go one way or another. And so it doesn't have to be a roadblock as it might appear to be. But then there is the land question as well. Russia has been reiterating now that Ukraine has to cede Luhansk and Donetsk, and there are the Moscow Times and others are constantly reporting about new villages in Luhansk and Donetsk and Luhansk being captured by the Russian side, which would come with freezing of the positions in Zaporizhia and Kherson. But the Ukrainian side, and Professor Mearsheimer says that it's impossible for anyone in Kiev to accept that for political reasons. So that also seems to be a big difference. What's your assessment about these two set of contradictions? Are they resolvable if astute diplomats and negotiators engage with them, or do you think these are something for political reasons irreconcilable?
I think what we have is both a failure of imagination and a failure of comprehension. And here I'll go back to security guarantees. What are they supposed to guarantee? If they are to guarantee an independent, neutral Ukraine that is not hostile to Russia, whether it likes Russia or not is another question, but is not overtly threatening to Russia, Russia will guarantee that. And others ought to want to guarantee it too, because the ideal place of Ukraine in European security architecture is as a buffer and a bridge between the Russian part of Europe and the other part of Europe. So the question then is, why do the Europeans keep proposing arrangements that basically guarantee continued confrontation and war? We started after the end of the Cold War. There was a phrase George H.W. Bush used, Europe whole and free. Ironically, we've ended up dividing Europe, and whatever was free is now in jeopardy. Of course, Ukraine is not a democracy anymore, so if it ever was. So we could talk about that, but I think that's pretty obvious. If you don't have legal political parties, if you don't have freedom of speech, if you can be press ganged into the army, you can't go to the church of your choice because the classic Russian Orthodox Church has been banned. If books are burned, if languages are regulated by the government in the way that they are in Ukraine, it's not a democracy. So we can forget that. Now, should the territorial issue, you said people in Kyiv can't accept that. Well, then the question is, who is in Kyiv? And who is in Kyiv is propped up by Western Ukrainians. And by the way, Western Ukrainians, of course, were added to Ukraine by Joseph Stalin. So we're defending a polity that represents the Soviet Union at its very worst. Territorial changes were thought, were accepted then. I think if you polled people in Ukraine in an honest poll, not the elite in Kyiv, I think they would agree to territorial exchanges. In fact, I've seen some reporting from the areas of Donetsk, which are still occupied by Ukraine, where people are saying, look, I just want the war over. I don't care what country I'm part of, leave me alone. So I think I disagree with John Mearsheimer that this is impossible. But what has to happen, therefore, is regime change in Kyiv. And ironically, of course, it was regime change in Kyiv in 2014 that started all this. That is regime change engineered by the United States and the British, which resulted in several things. First, a ban on the use of the Russian language in official discourse and for education, which was objected to by the 29% of Ukrainians whose native language was Russian. That led to an insurrection. That led to a civil war, basically, the bombardment of the two Donbas oblasts, Lugansk and Donetsk. And that eventually led to the massing of Ukrainian troops along the borders of the self-proclaimed republics there, Russian-speaking republics. And that, in turn, had a great deal to do with the timing of the Russian invasion. So we're back to regime change as a catalyst. And the second thing that happened in 2014, of course, was the prospect that Sevastopol, where the Russians have had a naval base for over 200 years, was going to be turned over to NATO. Um, and how could the Russians think that was an acceptable development? I think no, nothing is impossible, but the current leadership in Kiev will not agree to peace. And I doubt very much that the lower level discussions that would pave the way for a meeting between Putin and Zelensky will in fact take place. What does take place is technical discussions of things like the exchanges of corpses and prisoners of war and so forth. Nothing else. So we're a long way from a peace. But I guess the final point is major development at Anchorage was that President Trump gave up his silly idea of a ceasefire as an end in itself. Ceasefires, look at Cyprus, they perpetuate division. Look at the Korean Peninsula. They perpetuate the danger of war.
Or
They
Kashmir.
perpetuate Kashmir. Yes, they perpetuate confrontation, warfare, the danger of escalation in the war. They don't cure it. So a ceasefire makes a great deal of sense in the context of a peace. It should, and I noted in the meeting with between Trump and the Europeans in the Oval Office that the German Chancellor Merz said he could not imagine a peace that had not been preceded by a ceasefire. To which my response is, you obviously have no imagination at all, and you need some because ceasefires are useful only in the context of consolidating a broader settlement of the issues. And we see, for example, in Kosovo and in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the consequences of not resolving broader issues and putting in place truces. So this is not an appealing context. General Kellogg's idea of a DMZ in Ukraine to match the one in Korea was a terrible idea because it meant it guaranteed continued instability and confrontation in Europe. So the three issues the Russians have consistently raised with some frills, which might be negotiable, make sense to me. First, protection for Russian speakers and other minorities in Ukraine. That is consistent with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, rules. It is consistent with the original Ukrainian constitution, and it makes sense. Of course, now the Russians have concluded that the only way they can protect Russian speakers in the majority Russian-speaking areas is to annex the four oblasts or partial, at least parts of them in the east. Second, neutrality and no membership in NATO, no foreign troops in Ukraine for Ukraine. In other words, no threat from Ukraine to Russia, no threat from Ukraine to the rest of Europe. And people forget the second part in neutrality, which is that the Russians are out if that is the case. And the third issue, of course, is the one we have failed to discuss at all, except peripherally in this discussion, and that is the question of how you introduce stability and peace to Europe. Europe is not at peace. Europe is divided. Europe is divided between Russians and Europeans and Americans. And here I think President Trump did something else rather important as a gesture to his mega base in Anchorage. He basically set up a situation where he could say, okay, Europeans, you want to continue this fight? Go ahead, be my guest. I'll sell you the weapons. I'll make some money off this, but I'm not going to get involved myself. And the purpose of all this is Ukraine's losing the war. He knows it. And when Ukraine has definitively lost, he can say, look, I didn't withhold support from Ukraine. I just turned over the thing to the Europeans and they botched it. They bungled it. And it's Biden's war. I inherited it and I got rid of it for the United States. So I did, I wasn't able perhaps to make a peace, but I was able to disentangle the United States from this mess. I think that was the game he was playing. And of course, it's not that easy because the Europeans seem to be terminally stupid and warlike.
Your comment on Merz, the German chancellor, echoes what uh, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov spoke about the Europeans in general in that collective meeting. He said he didn't use the word lack of imagination, but he said apart from non-ethical and so on, he said they lacked constructive feedbacks. So it
No,
echoed.
they have a plan for continued war.
Right.
They do not have a plan for peace. It's that simple. They should be thinking about their own well-being. On the one hand, they fear the departure of the United States from Europe because part of the Trump gambit, to the extent it has any strategic rationale at all, is Europe, you handle Russia and we'll focus on China. And uh, I don't think the Russians and the Chinese find that an appealing prospect. So I don't think that's going to happen. And in fact, I think part of the answer for Europe, when and if it begins to think again, as opposed to posture, when and if the elites listen to the masses again, as opposed to ignoring them, uh, part of the answer will be a strategic autonomy for Europe, which involves a relationship with other great powers in the world, like India, like China, that is independent of their relationship with the United States, whatever that is. Um, and I would add Brazil in there as another major actor. The Arab world, of course, is so disunited and fractious that it is not a power. It makes Europe look united.
Yeah, I personally don't see that coming anytime soon, given how they
No,
behaved during the so-called tariff negotiations. I mean, these are not just tariff negotiations; these are whole economic
no,
relations, including investment relations and so on. But also how they have been behaving in these NATO meetings and the talks in Ukraine. I mean, completely acting as vassals. I mean, part of this that is because they don't represent their own people. I mean, these are concocted, non-representative, institutions that are floating above. And now that the economies are in doldrums, they have lost their completely lost legitimacy. And over and above, to not to mention, is the dependency of the European banking and financial system through London, but the continental banking system is completely hooked into the Wall Street. So there is this dual dependency on the United States. One is the security dependence on the NATO architecture, but secondly, more importantly, I feel, is the dependency on the financial system. So, excuse me. Um, but anyway, comment if you like on that. But very quick question I wanted to ask you, given the centrality of regime change you mentioned. By regime change, do you mean just a change, let's say Netanyahu going away? Because that's something which is not very hard to imagine, because there will maybe some electoral process. Or do you think the whole coalition of forces that back him? What do you mean by regime change in Ukraine?
well, I think Israel is a special case because it's not Netanyahu who's the problem. He is an opportunist. He is riding a wave of messianic religious Zionist support to keep himself out of jail. And if he goes to jail, the
Did I say
prospects.
Israel? My question was intended to be on Ukraine. Did I
Oh, I'm
say?
sorry. I
No, I'm
thought you said
sorry. Yeah,
Israel.
because yeah, maybe I misspoke. My
No, I mean, if
question was
it's
on
Ukraine,
Ukraine. Yes, given
yeah, no,
that's what you said in your answer.
yeah, no. I mean, Ukraine. There is a sense. I mean, we can see. I apologize for the deer behind me outside.
That's
The
beautiful.
uh, they eat everything. They're horrible anyway. But um, so I think the issue in Ukraine is the Ukrainian regime is very fragile at the moment. Has a lot of opposition. It's lost the support for the war that has fueled it up to now. You can see this in polling data very clearly. And it's the sense of fragility is expressed in an acceleration of the siphoning off of corruption generated money. A lot of money is going into the UAE and Cyprus and other places that are open to receiving such funds. And you get the sense that this is happening because people think, well, there might be an end of regime, and I better get my money out while I can. So I don't know what the exact situation is. You mentioned Nikolai Petro. He is really an expert on this sort of thing. I think he agrees that the Ukrainian government under Zelensky is now imperiled and not perhaps sustainable. Uh, so that could change the entire complexion of this issue. If you had a government in Kiev that was willing to compromise with Russia on the territorial issue and to go back to the essence of the Istanbul draft treaty of March, April. Yeah, you
Uh,
froze for a while.
Yeah, no, can you continue from here? I have come to Assam and there are these occasional power cuts. I kept a battery backup, but that switch needs like it's the periphery of India. But please
So
continue.
here
We'll
is
edit this out.
this is not unique to India. My parents during World War II left me in Long Beach. My father was in the Navy, an engineer. They went up to the Hollywood Bowl, which had been designed by Frank Lloyd Wright and had beautiful acoustical properties. It's been replaced by a subsequent design. And the power failed during a USO show. There was a musical show. And they called for a volunteer with a big voice and no inhibitions. And my father volunteered to MC the show. He went up and MC'd the show so successfully that he was assigned as the naval attaché to Hollywood for the rest of the war,
He is a
which was a better
talented
place
person.
than to be than on a ship in the South Pacific. Anyway, so power cuts, yes, of course. No, I think the regime in Ukraine, and by regime I mean the governing system as it now exists, not just personalities. The dominance of Western Ukrainians over the political complexion of governance in Ukraine. I think this is now in jeopardy. And I don't think people posit that just as the CIA and MI6 conspired to overthrow the previous government, pro-independence, neutral government of Ukraine on the grounds that it was approaching some alignment with Russia. People now posit that the CIA or MI6 or both might engineer a regime change again in Kyiv. I don't expect that, but I don't think it would be necessary. I think politics in Ukraine are evolving in their own direction and reflecting the fact that Ukraine has been clobbered. It has been destroyed, basically devastated. Its population is half what it was when the war began. Its army is crumbling. Its economy has been destroyed. Its infrastructure is being devastated by Russian missile attacks. And its only response is to try to extend the war deep into Russia, which inadvertently validates the Russian analysis that a Ukraine armed by foreign forces against Russia is a threat to Russia. So we're right back to where we were in December 2021, except now we have proof that the Russian fears are justified. And I understand President Trump is making a statement at noon Eastern time today from the Oval Office. Maybe it's on this subject. Um, he is very erratic. He still needs to change the subject because the sources of dissatisfaction and suspicion, including the Epstein files, are not going away. And as an attention grabber. And there are other issues as well. His regime is failing. I mean, it is a regime. It has essentially usurped many of the functions of our republic and is governing unconstitutionally without respect for the rule of law. This distresses a very large number of Americans, including some of his own followers. So he has a problem domestically. I don't know what he'll come up with to change the subject.
We'll leave it there, Ambassador Freeman. I had plans to discuss this whole, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, excuse me, China, India relationship between the global North and global South, but that will be an excuse for me to send you another invitation since we exhausted all our time. It was such a lovely conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And I look forward to a discussion of the restructuring of global politics and economics at some point in the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.